Okay, can everybody see this? Everybody see it? Shake your head. I see Gil there. Hi, Gil. Can you see it? Can you see the screen?
Yes,
Everybody?
we're
Okay,
good.
great. All right, so I'm now screen sharing. Let me move this up a little bit. Okay. All right. So I'm going to mute everybody, I think. Yes. So all of a sudden I'm starting to get directions. All right.
So, Dr. Lazarus, I think it seems to actually be when you started speaking. Like, I wonder if it's a fan on your computer or something.
Excuse me?
The feedback seems to maybe be coming from your computer. Everybody's muted now, but it's only now I'm hearing it a little.
Okay, I don't hear anything. And let me try to move the page. That's not happening. All right, lots of fun. All right. So let me share some pictures with you. And this was Hurricane Andrew. This was 1992. And now we see Hurricane Katrina. And the last one we will take a look at is Hurricane Ian. So we've had to deal with a lot of tough hurricanes here in Florida, unfortunately. All right, so one of the kinds of things we try to do when we're responding to natural disasters is to find out as much information as we can, because we don't want to give false information to anyone. So here's just a little bit of facts about what we know. It made landfall at Cayo Costa. It sustained winds of 150 miles per hour. It made impact a couple of times. It also made impact at Punta Gorda and near Pirate Harbor with 145 miles worth of wind damage. Okay, and this information is always up and about, and we're not necessarily sure in terms of, how current this is. But we do know that we've had, more than 100 deaths. But it depends in terms of how we define deaths. Is it like during the storm, after the storm, people, having heart attacks in the aftermath, etc. But this was basically much of it was also a flooding, and more people actually died in flooding than did die in the actual wind damage. So this is what we're going to cover tonight. And oops, I keep on getting admits, so I'm going to keep on admitting people. So what we're going to cover tonight is basically the crisis response, some concepts in mental health disasters, phases of disasters, what to expect, understanding trauma and loss, influence on children's responses to disasters, and trauma reactions based on developmental levels. I want to share some slides, but I may not discuss them. And the reason I do that is that way you can have information from the PowerPoint. And so I do tend in my presentations to maybe provide a little bit more information. It may make the presentation not as spontaneous, but you'll have a lot to leave with when the presentation is over. So, oops, let me go back. The other things I will cover is issues in recovery, actions to take prior to opening schools, actions to take on the first day of school and beyond, essential elements of crisis intervention, advice to parents and teachers, the importance of self-care, and a few lessons that I've actually learned during all my responses over the past 3 decades. So this is kind of what it all looks like, because I said you need to go there. And most anytime I respond to a natural disasters, I like to be in the place and really get the feel, the smells, talking to people. And it's so much different. I remember just even responding to Hurricane Andrew and seeing it on TV. And then when I actually did go down to the Homestead area, it was much different in terms of the vastness of it all that I couldn't just comprehend by watching it on TV. And the sense of dissociation I had in terms of not knowing where any of the streets were or seeing signs or just feeling a sense of disorientation. And so our response to hurricanes has not really changed very much, but we actually did get better in Florida since Hurricane Andrew. We had no help in Hurricane Andrew, hardly. And what we kind of learned during this process was to not wait for the cavalry. We had to be the cavalry. Since 92, the state has done a much, much better job in terms of responding to disasters. You know, we are the sunshine state, but we're also the hurricane state, unfortunately. And when you live in paradise, bad things do happen in paradise, and there is trouble in paradise. So you can just see a lot of these are from Fort Myers Beach, but we had damage all over the state. You can see just the boats, you know, coming up, you know, on the shore. Most of the time, it's really the poorer people that suffer the most in the aftermath of a disaster. And when you look in terms of influence of gender and sex, etc., racial, ethnic, you know, religious orientations, what we do seem to find is that it's the poorer people, the people without the best resources that tend to suffer the most. And quite often they're minoritized populations. We found that in Hurricane Katrina, and I visited a number of homes in Hurricane Katrina. And actually anybody that's going to be a presenter in NAS got a note last couple of days that your presentation was maybe accepted. And the coordinator of the NAS presentations, I visited her home, and her home had been like 9 feet underwater. So she just showed me, I went to her home, she says, this is my home. And it went all the way up to here, and it's right at the top of the ceiling. And it wasn't unusual in the aftermath of Hurricane Katrina, and I found that even in Irma in Everglades City, for people to move 4, 5, or 6, or 7 times during the course of a year. So kids aren't going to necessarily have stable homes if they've lost their homes. They may move with an uncle, their families may get split up, they may move in with another family, and you can have a family with 14 people in the house, and everybody is kind of very much discombobulated, and they may move again, and they may move again. Now, this is a DeLorean, and so this is a very wealthy person who actually lost his car. You can see more and more pictures. Some I don't know exactly, you know, what city they're in. This is from Orlando, and we kind of know it went all through the state. And you can just see people trying to cope. It's very emotional. Wow. And this is Sanibel where the bridge, you know, is collapsed. And now they have to get back and forth vis-a-vis boats or barges. Again, Fort Myers Beach. And here's the last one of Fort Myers Beach. Okay, so this is what happens. Crisis and trauma tend to throw people so far out of their range of balance that it's very difficult to establish a sense of equilibrium. And crisis reactions can be precipitated by either acute or chronic stress. And acute stress is caused by random, sudden, arbitrary events. And they certainly challenge all our ability to cope and to adapt. And here's what the short-term crisis reaction. And it occurs, one thing, it occurs across gender, ethnicity, age, culture. It's universal. You got your physical response. quite often you have a sense of shock, disorientation, a sense of numbness, fight or flight. Your adrenaline starts increasing, and some senses tend to heighten, and some senses tend to lighten. And so in some instances, depending upon what's occurring, you may have the sense of sound that just may reverberate through you. So in tornado responses, for example, I've responded to a few of those. Sound seems to be the biggest response, especially when it hits in the middle of the night. And so people have these strong sound reactions, or sometimes it could be the taste, or it could be a sense of smell. Everything just smells, especially after a period of time. Or it could be what they saw. And so some will be stronger and some will be weaker, but we're all going to be impacted by all our senses. And typically when I go through and do an evaluation of a child that's been impacted by any kind of disaster, whether it's a bus accident, a train wreck, etc., I go through each of the 5 senses and ask them to tell me what they saw, what they heard, what they felt, what they tasted, and what they smelled. You're going to have your heart rate go, the respiratory rate go. You're going to have muscle engorgement, vascular dilation. What ends up happening also is people tend to go on adrenaline for long periods of time. And so the long periods of time could be 2 days. And so it's not unusual for people not to sleep for 2 days or even 3 days. And eventually they collapse. They just kind of fall apart. And it's also very interesting in terms of sometimes people don't like to fall asleep. And one of the reasons they don't like to fall asleep, it's kind of unconscious, is because then the actual event is in the past. And it has a different sense of reality when the event is not in the present, but it's in the past, even though everything else is going on in the present. We find a lot, especially in regard to primarily in women, there may be a caretaker reaction, which creates a tend befriend reaction to protect children or loved ones. And so it's a very protective kind of response. That'll be a physical response. And then we have all the emotional reactions. And we have different stages. And the stages may be very quick. So shock, disbelief, and denial. Sometimes them only lasts like 10 or 15 or 20 seconds, or sometimes it can last for a whole day. So it's just going to reverberate based upon the individual involved. And then it's not unusual to have a cataclysm of emotions. And these emotions can kind of go back and forth within maybe 10 seconds or 20 seconds or 30 seconds. So you might feel a sense of guilt or self-blame, frustration, confusion, anger, rage, sorrow. And sometimes kids will do funny things that you think might be unusual, in which all of a sudden they're laughing and joking around, and then they break out in crying spurts. Or they get very, very angry, and they start screaming and yelling, and then all of a sudden they just end up in a fetal position. So it's a roller coaster. And it's a roller coaster of emotions that kids will experience. And it does take a long time before youngsters and adults, of course, establish a sense of equilibrium. So I'm going to go through some key concepts of disaster mental health, and then I'm going to respond to any questions that may come up, and then we'll be moving forward. So, some concepts that you should understand about disaster mental health. No one who sees a disaster is untouched by it. You're going to be affected. If you're responding to a crisis of this nature, and most of you are school psychologists, you will know that it's going to affect you, and it could affect you very deeply. It could affect your sleep. It could affect your eating. It could affect your mood. It could affect your relationships with others. It could make you more irritable, sad, etc. So you will be touched. And there are two types of disaster. One is individual and one is collective. And so we're dealing with a collective disaster, right now. Most people will pull together, and most people function fairly well during and after a disaster. So I haven't found that there's a lot of suicides during the disaster, but there may be some months later. So people are going to try and rally together, but because so much is coming at them, and they have to deal with so much that it's hard to think. So their problem-solving skills can often be diminished. And disaster stress and grief reactions are normal. I'm going to just repeat that. Normal responses to an abnormal situation. But it's not unusual for me to talk to people in the aftermath of a disaster. And they'll start talking to me about things. And they'll say, Dr. Lazarus, do you think I'm going crazy? I feel like I'm crazy. And I'll just, reassure them that these reactions are normal responses to an abnormal situation. But I do talk to people, and sometimes they say, I think I'm losing my mind. So most emotional reactions of disaster survivors stem from problems of living caused by the disaster itself. And disaster relief procedures have been called the second disaster. And I'll explain to you what I mean by that, is that what's going to be happening, and I guarantee this will happen. We are a con man state, and we do have, the home of a significant con man. And you're going to see con people coming into your community if you happen to live in a disaster area, trying to sign up people for new roofs, for new homes, for new, all kinds of services. And what they try to do is get a lot of money up front. And so you don't put it on your credit card, but you might, give them cash or give them checks or whatever. And they get as many contracts as they can, and they disappear. So everybody has to be very, very careful about that as a situation. So not only do they have that one disaster, but sometimes they can have, other disasters. And that's why it's called the second disaster. And I know it's going to happen in Florida. No doubt about it. Most people do not see themselves as needing mental health services following disaster, and they won't seek out services. So don't expect them, they're going to come to you. That's not necessarily what's going to happen. And they'll often reject disaster assistance of all types. And many people that are very proud don't like to sleep in shelters. Certainly. They don't like to ask for help. And they could have been on this earth for 50 years and they've never asked anybody for help. And all of a sudden they're homeless and they have to ask for help. And they can have a sense of shame and a sense of guilt around that particular concern. So just be aware of that, especially when you're dealing with the parents. They may have many feelings that they're unaccustomed to having. And so that's important to understand. Disaster mental health assistance is often more practical than psychological in nature. So it's practical. And you want to make sure that people get the help that they want, and then they talk to you while they're getting the help. And so if you're going out to a shelter, for example, try to give people a sense of choice, because a lot of people have lost control and a sense of choice over what they're, can get and what they can receive. So you say, would you like to have a ham sandwich? Or would you prefer a cheese sandwich? Or would you prefer a turkey sandwich? So the idea is to give people as many kinds of choices as they can to help establish a sense of personal agency. And disaster mental health services must be uniquely tailored to the communities that they serve. And if you're in, a district, you probably know the community, and it's going to be different in the Ninth Ward in New Orleans as it will be on Bourbon Street, for example. It'll be different in, Homestead than it will be in Weston. So we have to make sure that our services are connected to the communities that they serve. Okay, so mental health staff need to set aside traditional methods. Don't use mental health labels. Try to avoid that at all costs. And use an active outreach approach to intervene successfully in disaster. Just kind of reach out to people. So if you're going to a school, don't be sitting in your office. Be walking around the school. Be going into different try these to put on earbuds. I don't think it's going to work for this. I need different earbuds, sweetheart.
Oh, okay.
I don't know where they are. Okay.
There's audio feedback.
Am I still getting audio feedback?
Yeah, we're still getting a little bit of it. It seems like it's something to do with your mic, unfortunately. Everybody's muted, so
Because I don't hear any feedback here, but
I know. I'm sorry, Dr. Lazarus.
let me see if I'll take a quick break, and I have another set of earphones, and I don't know if that's going to help or not.
Yeah.
I can try that. I don't know.
You can definitely do that. And this is a good time for our participants. If you all want to start entering any questions that you might have in the chat, or even things that, not necessarily questions about material Dr. Lazarus has covered, but things that are just kind of on your mind right now in terms of responding to the students that you all are serving. And I know many of you, I see that you're from Lee County, Charlotte County, and many of you maybe are just now starting to even touch base with your students. So please do feel free to put your questions in the chat, or anything that's kind of burning on your minds right now, things that are maybe you're needing some assistance with. And thank you again to everybody for being here too. I'm seeing, okay, so question about, will the charter schools be given the same resources as the public schools? That's a great question, Crystal. And I'm not sure if even Dr. Lazarus will be able to answer that. But it's a very good question. I know that our Department of Ed partners will likely also be responding and working with some of your supervisors at the districts, and they'll be able to, I'm guessing, answer those types of questions. I see Stacy asking any guidance for that first week back. That's a really great question. And I'm sure Dr. Lazarus is planning to cover that. I'll make sure that if he wasn't able to hear that he sees it now. And Dr. Lazarus, I had muted you for a second, so you'll need to unmute again to join us.
Okay, I put on my earphones. Does that make a difference?
Yes, it seems much better. Thank you for that. Sorry.
Okay, I wish I would have known that. Okay.
I know, I'm sorry. We were trying to troubleshoot without interrupting you, but okay. So you do have a few questions, Dr. Lazarus. I'm seeing from Stacy Herrera, any guidance for the first week of school? Diane also had a question. She said, after Hurricane Andrew, I found it helpful in my elementary school to meet with groups of children. They drew pictures about what they experienced or any concerns they had. They used toys to demonstrate. And then we supported teachers in the classroom. Excellent. And then I'm also seeing someone commented, I think only I got this one, but it says, many of us have been through hurricanes, but this is my first experience with post-hurricane flooding. And any lessons or takeaways for the families that survived the hurricane, but then lost houses to flooding after the fact. So this might be stuff you're already planning to cover, Dr. Lazarus, but I wanted to make sure you saw that before we jump back in.
Yeah, that's the sad part of it. This is more, in many ways, this is a flooding disaster. I mean, if you weren't on the beach and you lost, your roof or your home, quite often your home is destroyed as a result of flooding. And when you're in a flood, it also, you get all these visceral, feelings. It smells, it's damp, it's stinky. And it's going to take a long, long time to kind of rebuild after a flood. And so a person may feel like, oh, I escaped it. But then they found out, you didn't escape it because now your home is all flooded. And it's going to take a long time for, this to be corrected and, for homes to be rebuilt. It won't be unusual for people, that do have flooded homes to leave the area and move to a different, part of Florida or a different state. And also what we also found was that in these kinds of situations, what ends up happening in some instances is maybe the parents might even split up, not because of a conflict between them, but due to somebody trying to take care of the kids and maybe the dad trying to support the family. And so he may have to go to a different place in order to get a job. And a lot of people have actually, will have lost their jobs or their place of business due to the hurricane disaster. Mm-hmm.
Dr. Lazarus, I'm sorry, we're still hearing feedback. Do you think it's possible to maybe even try another device in the house? Or
I mean, my wife has a computer on, I could try hers.
I know I'm just hearing from folks, it's not, I'm hearing feedback, but other folks are telling me that it's like a very low volume. So it might be worth us taking a break to just make a quick swap. And in the meantime, I can field some questions here too from folks.
Okay, let me, could you send a share? Well, I guess what I'll have to do is share screen with Jane Laz. And I'll take put it on a flash drive and then put the PowerPoint on my wife's computer with a flash drive.
Okay, awesome.
I think. I'm sorry, but I don't know if that's going to work, but we can try.
I think that'll work. Yeah, that should be great. I'm sorry.
Okay.
Everybody, while we work through the technical difficulties, and I'm hearing, okay, please continue to put your questions in the chat. I think we're getting some really good questions. And what I'm going to do is kind of keep a list of these so that when Dr. Lazarus returns, we've got some good ideas here. And I saw there was someone who actually messaged me privately. I put it in the chat, who said, is there a general guideline for when an initial trauma response becomes more of a concern, as far as like a timeline for how long we should treat behavioral changes as a typical response versus indicative of a new or developing mental health issue? And I know we actually, I don't want to put anyone on the spot. I know we have some other trauma experts here on the webinar. And so for any of you all, I know a colleague that writes often with Dr. Lazarus is here in the audience, please feel free to jump in. And I think another resource to share with you all is the Prepare curriculum. And so I'm not sure how many of the school psychologists here in the audience are trained in the Prepare curriculum, but the Prepare curriculum does cover a lot of this kind of information as well. So if you would like to take a quick bathroom break and then rejoin us here in just a minute when Dr. Lazarus gets started back again, please feel free to do that. And if not, please continue to put those questions in the chat.
Angela, were you referring to me?
I was just messaging you, Dr. Slokowski.
Welcome to the University of Alabama for a second, everybody. Can you repeat the question?
Yeah, so one of the questions, and I'm going to go ahead and make you a co-host too, Dr. Solkowski. One of the questions that one of our participants had is, like, I think the question is basically, at what point does this become kind of like cross the line from being a normative response to a natural disaster like this into something that's of maybe a bigger concern, or maybe is crossing into more of like a kind of clinical range, right? And I'm seeing we have another kind of similar question. So
yeah, I wish I had like the definitive, this is the answer kind of reply. A lot of it has to do with myriad factors as they intersect. So part of it is the nature of the crisis itself. Is it something that's acute, where it's over in a matter of minutes and then you go into the recovery postvention phase? Or is it something that's ongoing with a lot of uncertainty built into it, which is kind of the case that's going on right now for a lot of places in Florida. There's still continued flooding. There's issues with restoring power. There is, infrastructure that's been destroyed. So there isn't a clear answer there. A lot of it has to do with when you can reestablish a sense of stability. So students are back in schools, parents are involved in getting back to work, cleaning up the house, doing whatever they got to do, working with relatives. So I think, when you're seeing, continual destabilization in the child's behavior, so market changes in behavior that tend to go on for weeks into months, you definitely want to be paying a lot of attention and providing the students with support. It doesn't hurt to triage, I think, a little bit more liberally. And yeah, sure, students do typically, based on just natural coping mechanisms, rebound. Most of them do, but making sure that supports are available for everybody who may need them, and then paying attention to the students who are most proximate to the disaster, the crisis, whether that be physically or emotionally, to either their loved ones or victims that they might identify with. And just really trying to, I think through who would be most impacted and then monitor those students. So I don't have a clear answer. I know I put a lot of stuff out there, but so much of it, I think, really is related to the nature of the trauma. And then is it something that's short-term in duration, or is it something that's going to be going on for a long time without a clear resolution? And then paying attention to how long are the students or the youth or the parents or whoever it is in the community displaying disruptions in their kind of typical functioning. So I wish I had a more perfect answer, but that's what I got for you.
Can you hear me?
yes, thank you, Dr. Solkowski, and thank you, Dr. Lazarus. The audio sounds so much better.
Okay, so let me go to back again to slideshow. And I'm gonna have to go through them real quick. Let's see.
And I think, Dr. Solkowski, I think to just kind of build on what you were saying, I mean, I remember from my own prepared training that, one of the initial phases of this crisis response is almost starting to kind of better assess where, what the impact has been for students, because I mean, I see people saying in the chat that, the experiences in Katrina are going to be different than the experiences of Ian, and even across districts, there are different experiences, right? So it just with regards to this storm. So I think that, that will be one of the first things that as students come back, and even right now in this phase, as you're reaching out to students, right, where trying to get a better sense of who is impacted in what ways and what their experience has been, and then beginning to kind of tier or like triage who might need the most supports. And you can fill me in if I'm off base there, Dr. Solkowski. I'm a little rusty on my virtual training.
Okay, yeah, Dr. Solkowski and I had written, in regard to Hurricane Katrina, and we also wrote an article together in regard to responding to technological disasters. And we also have something that's going to come up in this PowerPoint in terms that we put together as it relates to Hopful's research in regard to the 5 critical elements related to crisis intervention that have been supported by research. Okay, so I'll go through a little bit. Okay, so we're going to see some phases in the disaster, and this is a little bit better. Okay, good.
Much better. Thank you so much.
Okay, all right, so here we are. You have the heroic phase, and we're kind of a little bit into that. Everybody kind of gathers together, they all get excited, and everybody's freezer, goes out, and so they don't necessarily have, electricity, and they gather in the streets and they have barbecues, and everybody works together, and they meet new neighbors that they never knew they had before. And everybody says, oh, Florida's great, our community is great, we really work together, terrific. And then you have a kind of a honeymoon thing where you think things are getting better. And then it's not unusual, you're going to get a disillusionment phase in which things just don't seem to get better. They just seem to get stagnant, and the help doesn't come. And then the reconstruction phase, which can be several years later, can actually happen. So when you're working with kids, these are some things to think about. I always think in terms of loss. It's maybe not the best thing to think about, but this is what happens. And so kids lose their possessions. They lose their room. They lose their home, their neighbors, their neighborhood. Sometimes they lose their community. Their friends may scatter. They may lose the school that they go to. Their relatives may move away, or they may lose contact with their church. Some kids may have actually lost their pets, where their pets die in the storm, or they can't take their pets with them. And it's also dealing with some existential losses that kids can actually experience, such as loss of control over one's life. This doesn't happen probably as much, but sometimes it does happen. Loss of faith in one's religious or spiritual belief system. Loss of trust in other people. More of this is in the government. We found a lot of that happen in the aftermath of Katrina, where they didn't trust the local government, they didn't trust the state government, and they didn't trust the federal government at all. And also a loss of worldview, of fairness and justice. And then people will lose people in the storm. I have no idea in terms of how many lives are being lost here. And we're hearing all kinds of estimates going from over 100 to 10,000 missing people. So I don't really know. But loss of meaningful and sentimental property. This could happen even if you don't lose your home. A loss of a sense of immortality and invulnerability. So it's maybe the first time that people feel that they could actually die. And it never had actually hit them before. So it changes their sense of worldview. And a loss of future and expected rites of passage. So if a kid loses his school and has to go to a different school, we found this a lot in Katrina, they may have been on the basketball team and no longer are they in the basketball team. They may have been in cheerleaders and now they're not in cheerleaders. They may have expected to have a quince and that doesn't, happen. Or maybe they're going to have a graduation from their own school, or they're a member of different clubs. And lots of these rites of passages don't necessarily occur. They used to be on the football team. They're no longer a football team member. And so this can be very, very, challenging to youngsters. They have to make all kinds of adjustments. One thing that you should probably expect would be regression. And kids will regress, and that's normal, and that's okay. So I kind of like mountain climbing movies, and I've done a little climbing, but not, major climbing. But think in terms of this. If you're doing high altitude climbing and you're up about 14,000 feet or 13,000 feet, and you start getting a little bit dizzy, and all of a sudden you start sweating and you start having heart palpitations and you get dizzy and you feel you're going to faint. Basically, you have three different options. Option one is kind of suck it up and go forward. Option two is to stay where you are and try to wait till your body adjusts. And option three is to go down to a lower altitude. And since there's so many people on here, I can't see who's responding, but try and think in your own mind, what would be the best response here? And actually, there's only one good response. The one good response is you go down to a lower altitude. And then you establish your equilibrium there. And then eventually you can move up the mountain. So that's probably the best example I have in terms of regression. And kids will regress, and don't be concerned or worried about it unless it seems to last for months. And so that's an expectation. So here are some examples on the slide for different kinds of regression. All right, so let's look over here. I'm at 8 o'clock. Okay, so I'm doing okay. In terms of the influences that a child's reaction to natural disasters. And we get this from NOVA, we get this from the CDC. There's a lot of support for this information. So the storm's exposure or proximity will really make a great deal of difference. How close it was. Were you in the heart of it or were you in the periphery? The nature of the warning. Fortunately, I think most people did have good warnings, but what we've seen in Andrew, what we saw in Katrina, and what we saw in Ian is that they get pretty close, but they can be like 50 or 60 miles off. And so we kind of thought it may be hitting more north in terms of Tampa, but it didn't. It hit south, towards Fort Myers Beach. And so their warning was a little bit different and they didn't necessarily prepare that well. And that happened in Florida where we thought it was hitting more towards Broward County, but it ended up right at the last minute going south and hitting South Dade County, for example. How fast it goes, the speed of the onset. Perceived level of threat, how threatened did the person feel? So this is one of the reasons why it doesn't necessarily impact our preschool children in the same way that it's going to impact elementary school children or high school children, because they don't necessarily feel that same level of threat.
One big thing, because I interviewed a lot of people in the aftermath of Hurricane Andrew, and it was a fear of loss of life. If a person's in a home and the water keeps on rising and rising, and they feel that they're going to die, and they feel almost convinced that they're going to die, their life view changes. And physiologically, based upon a trauma response, their body changes as well. So that's one of the biggest things I always ask in terms of, did you feel as if you were going to die in the disaster? Exposure to death and destruction. So there's going to be a lot of death and destruction, especially if one is, right in the center of it. And the sad thing about it is that it's going to be constant. So you drive out of or you leave your home and you see just destruction all around you, whether it's a fire or a flood, etc. And so it's not like something that you can escape. It's going to be a constant reminder. Whereas if a person's in a school shooting, they may not, be going by the school, that often. I mean, especially if they don't, if they leave that school. And so they're not getting these constant physical reminders. And so that really makes a difference. You get constant physical reminders. And how long did it last? Did it last for 10 seconds? Did it last for 3 minutes? Did it last for 4 hours? How long were you in the home when the hurricane hit? Or were you in the home? So these are all things that do influence the response of a child or, any individual. Additional factors are dislocation from the home or the community. What we found is that dislocation is going to have a major negative effect because then they lose all their support, most of their support systems. Level of parental support. Parental support is really key. And if parents are taking so much care of their own survival needs and their own need to support themselves, to find new places to live, etc., quite often they don't necessarily have a lot of support for kids. It's hard. It's really hard because they're overwhelmed. And, it's like a pot that's boiling over. And they're just at that boiling point and they don't have any place to kind of cool down to take care of their kids as much. And then pre-existing risks, previous traumatic experiences or mental illness. And another thing I also look at right now is the number of ACEs, that's adverse childhood experiences, that the child has experienced during his or her lifetime. And so all these are factors that influence a child's reactions. And there's the phrase like whatever, doesn't kill me makes me stronger. I don't necessarily agree with that because sometimes you have one bad experience followed by another, and it really adds a big weight to a child or to a family. All right. We have some good research that shows that altered family functioning, separations from parents after disasters, ongoing maternal preoccupation with the trauma are more predictive of the trauma symptomatology of children than is the level of exposure. So I'll leave this on so you can kind of take that in. It's really how well we have been taken care of by our family and how supportive the family has been, especially the mom, in terms of the well-being of the child. And as I said before, I'm not going to discuss the reactions, but you can see some of them. And I'm sure as a school psychologist or, an educator or social worker, you're familiar with what you might expect. Okay, let me go a little bit to long-term crisis reactions. And many victims may continue to be reminded or re-experience some degree of crisis reactions over a longer period of time. And we know we do have anniversary reactions. And we actually even plan for anniversary reactions. And I once had interviewed the principal of Columbine High School. And he prepares for the anniversary of the Columbine disaster. He noticed that he'd become irritable. He would become angry. He would go into funks and depression. And he required a lot of therapy in terms of responding to the crisis. And every year, right around the exact date of the Columbine anniversary, he would go into a major funk. And this was 20 years later. So these are called kindling events. And any kind of reminder can set off an individual. Okay. Now, it's not unusual for people to experience these traumatic crisis reactions for years. And in my private practice in regard to therapy, it wasn't unusual for me to see people 2 to 3 years after Hurricane Andrew. And they would come in and say, I need help. I've been, struggling with this for the last 2 to 3 years. And all of a sudden they come in and they want to get some, psychological assistance. And we're probably very familiar with this because much of this relates to acute stress disorder. And these are all the different signs and symptoms that we're going to get from acute stress disorder. In some instances, it does become, PTSD. But this is something that we should maybe accept. Now, here's something that I do seem to find, and that is it's the 20-60-20 rule. And I think this rule is very helpful. And about 20% of those experiencing trauma will adapt and return to normal functioning within a brief period of time, maybe 2 weeks, 4 weeks, 6 weeks. And about 60% will experience some time of stress reaction for a period of time that will impair their functioning. So it could last for, a long period of time. And then about 20%, so maybe 1 out of 5, will suffer extensive impairment in one or more of life functions. And so you as school psychologists will really need to try to figure out who this 20% is and make sure that they're getting the help that they will require. So we'll go through this here in terms of recovery from trauma. And this is what we find seems in the literature most supported in terms of how people recover. The severity of the incident and the level of the crisis reaction. The ability to really process and to understand exactly what's happening in that person's life and to kind of make some sense out of it. People that were more stable before the crisis tend to be more stable post-crisis. So pre-crisis stability, people that were, had more borderline, personality kinds of conditions, or were, had a lot of problems in terms of controlling their emotional reactions. This seems to exacerbate it. The breadth and the nature and the quality of your support system. So youngsters that have a whole bunch of support system, have a lot of friends, and connect with people very easily, they seem to do, much better. It really makes sense. So one of the kinds of things we try to do in schools, and you should be trying to do, is to figure out how we can do more school-wide support systems. Access to help. It doesn't necessarily mean psychological help. It could just be a mentor. It could be some friends. It could be more family members. It could be a church. It could be a support group that's set up. It could be a sports team, scouting, a church choir, many different kinds of things. So how your support system is, and how you're able to get help from different people, and the degree to which experience is validated by culture and others. So some cultures tend to be very stoic. We found this in Japan after the nuclear disaster, and that they tend to keep their feelings very tight. They don't want to admit that they need help. They're very concerned in regard to showing any kind of emotion. And this was difficult, and it's also not validated to show emotions. And so their kinds of reactions are going to be a little bit different, and they have to respond differently to cultures, especially Asian cultures. All right, so here's something to look at when we look in terms of recovery. So the victim gaining some meaningful perception of control over their life and their event. So what we're really looking at is, how do they kind of integrate this into the fabric of their life? And how do they understand it, and how do they come up with new understandings? The next is working out an understanding of the incident, and maybe they redefine their values or their worldview. How do they go about seeing the world now, and maybe a little bit different of a way? And maybe do they do things that maybe look in terms of helping others? Do they become more impulsive, more self-involved, and think, well, life is short, I'm just going to do crazy and wild things, and it doesn't make a difference. So we kind of need to look at that at an individual level. Reestablishing a sense of future and personal goals. And so if people think, well, the whole world's just going to blow up, this is just one part of it, and screw everything else, I'm just going to go out and I'm not going to do my homework. I'm not going to, I'm just going to go have fun, and I'm going to do drugs, etc. So, that can be another way of coping, and reestablishing a sense of meaning and integrating the event into one's personal narrative. So these are some recovery issues for survivors. And here are some influences. I'll go through some influences, and then I'll respond to some more questions that you may have. So I always think in terms of the 3 F's: family, faith, and friends. These are the most important. And quite often, even if I'm doing an evaluation of a child, I may ask them to, I may put out cards with all these different words that I have on there, and ask them what helped a lot, what helped some, and what didn't really make a difference. And so God, prayer, church, clergy, support groups, peers, these are all influences that make a difference. Actually, we do find psychologists and counselors on this list as well, but pets are more important. than you guys are in most instances. So it's not unusual for kids to play with their pets, talk to their pets, comfort their pets, and pets are very important in the lives of children. Some, everybody has their own way of dealing with things. So some kids might like to write journals, some may do art, some may do music, some involve themselves in hobbies, in sports and teams and clubs, etc. So, and actually in the aftermath of another disaster, the Parkland shooting, we had a number of kids that all got together on the 1-year anniversary of the Parkland shooting. And they were given a choice. They could either go to their school or they could instead do anything that they wanted, at home. And so there were a group of 6 youngsters that said, let's do some art projects together. And one of the students was an artist, or she, dabbled in art and she liked to draw. So she got the students together and they all went to the art store and they gathered books and, canvases and paints and they went back to her home and they all just painted their feelings as it related to the Parkland shooting. And one of the paintings was so extraordinary and I liked it so much, and it was done by a 16-year-old male student, then I asked him if I could actually take this picture and put it on a cover of a book. And so actually we did have it on a cover of a book. And it was very, very powerful cover. So it was really appreciated. So kids do a lot of amazing things when they recover from trauma. And actually after a tornado hit an area in Kissimmee, I co-led a crisis response, I think with Frank Zaneri, up to Kissimmee, and half the school was destroyed by the tornado, and the other half of the school was intact. And they developed art and music and drama about the tornado in order to help survive. And very interestingly, about a year later, NASP had their convention in Orlando. And the singers that came to perform at the NASP convention were members from the school, and they had sung one of their songs was about their recovery efforts at their school in Kissimmee. And it just brought tears to my eyes. It was just so emotional. And so sometimes you get some very, very positive influences from recovering from trauma. All right, so let me respond to any kinds of questions that you may have. So I could go to the chat or I can have Angela. Angela, you still there?
I am. Yeah, I've been collecting some questions for you, Dr. Lazarus, and trying to kind of field some of them, but we have some really good ones. One person asked, we talked earlier while you were kind of setting up on the new computer about just like how to know when something crosses from maybe like a typical response to the storm into trauma. And I think kind of connected to that, one thing that someone mentioned is, and I've heard this actually talking to other folks, that, this maybe generation or cohort of kids that are going to be impacted by the storm have already been impacted by the pandemic. They've now been exposed to Uvalde, amongst other mass violence incidents. And so to even speak to what you're saying about how, in terms of where people are when traumas like this hit, I just wonder if you have any additional thoughts or tips for people about, kind of that triaging process and how to know when a kid is really needing more intensive services.
Right. Yeah. And that's kind of what we end up doing. We do triage. And sometimes the teachers, you really got to work with the teachers and have the teachers maybe come up with a list in their classroom in terms of what kids are struggling with focusing, which kids are struggling with concentrating on their work, what kids seem to have change in affect or change in mood, what kind of behavioral concerns are you finding? So if you could, I can come by the classroom, and if you give me a list of those students that you just seem to find that seem to be outwardly struggling, there may be a lot of kids that are inwardly struggling, which you may not be able to necessarily determine, but you can, find that the teachers can be very good reporters. And then you could also send out notes to parents saying, what kinds of changes have you seen in your child or in your family? And how concerned are you in regard to your child and your family? So reach out to the teachers, reach out to the parents, and try to figure out some of the kids that may be at higher risk. That's a good kind of way to start. And the other thing that I've heard is that children's social skills and emotional skills have actually decreased, and we have some data to support that, due to COVID and youngsters not necessarily being socially connected. And so their sense of social connection and that support that's so critically important, has already been interrupted. And now if they're going to a different school or they don't have a school to go to, et cetera, it's going to be even worse. So I think it's just something to keep in the back of our mind. And it's not easy being a student any longer. Obviously, it's much more troublesome than when I was a student many, many moons ago. And so, yes, I think the COVID epidemic really is going to have a significant impact in regard to the many connections that kids have. And the more connections you can do, and the more you can do as a school psychologist or a teacher, to forge connections, get kids connected, I think would really make a big, big difference. But, so do want to respond to that. And also previous trauma. So if kids have been more traumatized by COVID, and there could be, their parents could have been ill, they could have been ill, maybe they lost a loved one, parents lost a job, all kinds of other things. So you can have one trauma upon another trauma. And also the socioeconomic status typically will make a big difference. And for example, when we looked in terms of, in urban inner city schools, the number of ACEs is much greater than in more suburban kinds of schools. So schools with money and resources tend to fare better than schools without money and resources. And when we assign school psychologists to schools, we usually do it in terms of numbers, like so many schools, et cetera, as opposed to need. But there will be more needy communities out there in the aftermath. And we may have to look in terms of how we prioritize things.
That's really helpful. And I think for any of you attending who aren't familiar with the ACEs, but what Dr. Lazarus is talking about are those adverse childhood experiences. So again, those are kind of some of our tells that kids might be at greater risk for trauma if they've experienced, some more major disruptions in their life, like moves, for example, or their parents divorcing, exposure to abuse. I think you've already touched on this a little bit, Dr. Lazarus, but I know the biggest thing I keep hearing again is like, what do we do that first week? I'm hearing lots of need for maybe social skills and kind of connecting students and social emotional learning type skills. But yeah, I think any specific maybe activities or guidance you could give about like, what do we do when the kids first come back?
Okay, let me go to that right now. I'm going to skip that. And I'll go to that. Okay, so here's some things for intervention, and then I'm going to discuss things to do before school starts and what to do during the first week of school and beyond. So children with many early symptoms are likely to have more persistent stress. So interventions have to figure social support, anything you can do, group work, social support, getting to know each other, doing group projects, all that kind of stuff really, really helps. Promoting effective coping strategies, like kind of what worked with you, having discussions with kids. And in group crisis intervention in classrooms, we usually do that. And so, I'm talking to Carol, or I'm talking to Michael, or I'm talking to Jane, or I'm talking to Angela. And I'll say, Angela, what kind of helped you the most in terms of, dealing with, what happened during this terrible hurricane? And you may say, well, I like to play with my dog. And then Michael might say, well, I like to play with my dog too, but we couldn't take care of my dog because we had to move into somebody else's house. So I had to give my dog to somebody else. My uncle who lives in South Carolina took my dog, so I don't have a dog to take care of right now. And then the teacher gets the other. Why don't you go to Angela's house and maybe you guys can play with, Angela's dog, or think, kind of look in terms of how people can connect with each other, what kind of commonalities they have. Or maybe it might be listening to music. So, maybe bringing in your favorite music. Or, let's create a Hurricane Ian dance. I like to dance. So you may say, let's take a 5-minute dance time, or let's do jumping jacks, or let's look in terms of listening to calming music, or let's just do some kind of activity, let's do hula hoops, or, whatever it could actually be to help kids cope in positive ways. Or let's have longer recess. Or just any creative way that anybody can think of to get kids connected and involved. More sharing of time. Helping family members who are effective. I really find that the school can be a hub for help. And I wrote an article about that with Patty Del Valle, and the school can really be a fantastic resource to help. And I don't know if Mary Alice Myers is on here, but we helped Mary Alice in the aftermath of the tornado that hit her school. And this was when I was FAST president, and we ended up going out to her school, and we had an evening where the insurance people were there, FEMA was there, our pastors were there, social support services were there, etc. And people would go, we had an introduction, something like what I'm doing here now, but shorter. And then folks would go from table to table in terms of what they needed help with. Another kind of thing that, and I'm going to keep on going, but teachers helping teachers support stuff is really important. So you could put up on a bulletin board kind of what I need. I need a babysitter, or I need someone to walk my dog, or I need someone to, I lost my car in the aftermath. I need someone to take me grocery shopping, or whatever it might, whatever might be needed. And people quite often will actually, respond to that. So teachers helping teachers kind of list so that everybody would know what people needed, because people don't know what you need. And so you have to tell them and have a way of communicating these needs to others. Okay. So teaching children how to handle future events. Okay, so I'm kind of getting to your question. Good, and we do have some time. So prior to opening schools, establish means of communication, figure out where everybody is. Teachers can really do a good job in terms of doing that. People have lost self-coverage, et cetera. So a little bit of a challenge. Establish contact among all members of the crisis response team and school administrators to figure out the level of response needed. Some schools are going to need a lot of response. Some might need some moderate response and some might need minimal response. So not every school, in the county is going to require the same level of response. So that's important to kind of figure out, which schools require and which kids require the most response. Assess the damage and make appropriate accommodations. Some districts have memorandums of understanding between their district and outlying districts. And they work with building personnel and custodial personnel. And we found that it happened really well in Hardy County, where they worked with Orange County and some surrounding counties. And they thought it was going to take 6 weeks to actually open the school because their schools were such a mess. Just debris all over, they smell, they were, awful. And Orange County was a big county, it's in the Orlando area. And they had a memorandum of understanding and they came down, and they were put on leave from Orange County and they also worked during the weekends. And so they put the whole Hardy County system up and running instead of maybe taking 6 or 8 weeks in about a week. So it's just like all hands on deck. Really made a big difference. Try and figure out the survival and emotional needs of faculty and staff. So you may come up with some kind of survey in terms of, what happened to you, what are your survival needs, what are your emotional needs, and what can the school do to help. So these are, I think, important things that you can do before school even opens. And also make sure you get good information. So I remember in Kissimmee, we found out after a tornado that just destroyed all these homes, a lot of trailer homes. You don't want to live in a trailer park during a tornado, unfortunately. So, but we found out that nobody had died. And so that was really, really, really good news. And so we made that announcement that nobody had died, even though a lot of people lost their homes. And we were able to really gather good information about what was going on in the community and the kind of community supports that are there. Okay. Designate a spokesperson to provide information to the media. That's really important. That's not really your job. But figure out the staff needs and provide assistance. There may be a few staff members that are just homeless and they need a lot of help. Contact all families needing help. This really has to be a good coordination. And I was talking before about the homeless liaison, and really work in tandem with the homeless liaison. Find out who, is not in their own homes. And they have a lot of rights. So figure out what all those rights are by the McKinney-Vento Act and review that. And I'll talk about how you can actually help children. Provide critical information to families. Schools should be putting out information all the time in regard to this is what we're doing. School's opening this day, and this is what we're going to be doing the first day. This is what we're going to be doing the second day. This is what we're going to be doing the third day, etc. So good communication, I think, is really critical. And school psychologists, you can use what I have here, conduct staff trainings. So training the staff and different kinds of things. And you can even do some debriefing, with staff either before or after school. All right, so what not to expect. Don't expect to do school right away. That's just not a good way to go about it. Think you got to really look in terms of the whole child and the emotional well-being of that each and every child. Academic demands just need to be modified. As the superintendent in Hardy said, we can't ask kids to do homework because a lot of kids don't have homes. So we look in terms of how we make academic demands. If you do have some homework, let the kids do homework in class as opposed to at home. Try to reach out to every student in the building. I found that when the principal or the assistant principal went to every single classroom, it's a little easier to do it in elementary school than maybe a middle school or high school. But they greeted every single child, they walked up to every single child, and they said to every single child in some way, you matter to me. I'm glad you're a member of this school. I'm glad you're a member of this community, and we're all going to pull together to make things as best as we can. It's not going to be easy. It's going to be hard, but we're all going to try and work together as a school team. I think that message is really important. I talked a little bit about post-disaster activities. It could be art, it could be music, it could be physical events, it could be putting together, some large events in the school gymnasium, etc. It could be rallies, it could be bringing in speakers, anything that's going to promote healing, I think would be very helpful. Try to use methods that were learned about following the disaster. Like in math, you can study things related to hurricanes, the same in science, in biology, etc. Get some administrative support if warranted. So figure out how to find people to support the administration and do a lot of communication with your administration in terms of what's needed. Some principals are very psychologically minded, others are not. So, you can really look in terms of being a consultant to your principal. Provide them necessary information. NASP has lots and lots of information typically, on site, and just go to nasponline.org, and you can usually get lots of information in terms of helping. And ensure adequate mental health support by coordinating. Obviously, it's more challenging right now because we don't have enough support out there. So it's a big challenge. But how do we get support to children that need it, and work with your local mental health providers and your community mental health systems to provide good mental health support for those that require it. Okay, this is the question you asked, and I think I responded to it. Identify students who are at high risk and plan interventions. So that's that triage piece. Who's at risk? How do we help them? Let's come up with a plan. Let's do maybe check in, check out mental health. That's, just even having kids come in, check out, and find out who needs help. We want to debrief all members of the crisis response team. And so you may have a school-wide, you may have a county-wide, you may have a small school crisis response team that covers one area of a county. So debriefing is always good. Or even if you can't do it formally, just do it informally. So, the psychologists can kind of work together and just have a short 15, 20-minute debriefing. Fortunately, my wife, Jane, is great to debrief with. So whenever I would go to a crisis or she would have a crisis, we debrief with each other. And she's also pretty good at putting up shutters too. So we would actually, do that together. And practicing self-care, I think, is also critically important. All right, these are some of the things that are supported in the literature. And these are the 5 factors that in terms of meta-analysis have been shown to make a difference. Promoting a sense of safety, calming and supporting fearful individuals, engendering a sense of self and collective efficacy, increasing feelings of connectedness with others, and instilling and inspiring hope in victims. So one thing to do is reassure students of their safety if they are safe. Don't lie. If they're not safe, then that's a different situation. Give students accurate, up-to-date information. Just lots of good information is helpful. And you know how we all want information, a crisis happens, we want to follow that as best as we can. Reestablish familiar routines as quickly as possible, and find some balance with academic demands. And that's always, somewhat of a challenge. And I find that just even over, a period of months going out to Everglades School, when do we start pushing the kids a little bit harder? When do we put the academic demands on them? When do we make sure that children don't take advantage of the hurricane Irma to not be doing the work that they need to do? And then usually sometimes it becomes self-evident when that ends up happening, but it's a tightrope and you have to do that very carefully. And everybody's going to have maybe a little bit of a different opinion. But the idea is right at the beginning to take care of their emotional needs first, because I believe that's foundational. And if you can't focus, you can't concentrate, you can't emotionally balance, how can you possibly learn? Calming and supporting individuals. Reassure students that reactions to a crisis can be different for each person. Identify trusted adults that students can seek for support when they're ready to talk about the experiences and emotions. And people don't necessarily need to know the right thing. They just need to be able to listen. Teach positive coping actions. And you as school psychologists should know some of these things in terms of diaphragmatic breathing, journaling, positive self-talk, calming, quiet music, all kinds of positive things that help us cope. And, teach teachers to do this in the classroom. Refer highly impacted students to community agencies, we've discussed already. I like to get volunteer opportunities with local community agencies. Kids feel better when they make a difference. And so when, it's an old adage, one of the best ways to help yourself is by helping others. So when kids help others, they feel better. And they can actually have some good post-traumatic growth by helping other people. So just asking people to help, sometimes they'll do it, somebody that they trust. And they may not necessarily volunteer, but quite often if you ask them, could you help out this child, or could you help this teacher, or could you help? Quite often they'll say, yeah, sure, I'll do that. And kids like to help, even kids that you think are all kinds of behavioral problems. That's one of the most important things that they like to do. My son, who is a bit ADHD and was kind of acting out, as ADHD kind of kids do in school. One of his best experiences was really going into classes a couple of years younger and reading to the kids and helping out the kids. He said, oh, I had such a great day in school. I went to the first graders and I read them books. He was a very good reader. And he says, that was so much fun. I really liked, I liked doing that. And it was terrific. And so anything that kids can do to help another kid, I think is, something that's meaningful. Involve students in collaborative group projects. Let me get a drink of water for a second.
And just quickly, since while Dr. Lazarus is getting some water, we got some really great questions about redirecting students to like local mental health services. And I did post, if you're in the Lee Collier County area, there have been some good articles coming out of Naples News that can direct you to some resources. And obviously we'll be scanning, media in other areas for more resources as they become available too.
Thank you, Angela.
Yeah.
And Angela, that has worked a lot with kids in trauma and has written about that as well. So I really appreciate all your comments. Okay. Increasing, a feeling of connectedness with others, which we talked a little bit about. And just do this mental health check-in, check-out with trusted adults or school mental health professionals. I think that's an important thing. It doesn't necessarily need to be you as a school psychologist. Sometimes a counselor, maybe a trusted teacher, maybe just someone on staff, maybe someone that, works in the office, but, let them check in, check out on a regular kind of basis. Just the idea that somebody really cares about them, I think really makes a difference. I like that. Use social media and related platforms to maintain some communication and connections with students and families. And work with the families. We used to put on workshops for the families. And one of the kinds of things you may want to do if you are a school psychologist, do a in school or after school workshop with families, just trying to tell them what to expect and information sessions. So if it's going to take you 6 hours or 8 hours to evaluate a student for, some special education category, instead of spending those 8 hours doing an evaluation and writing up a report, think in terms of how I can spend 8 hours in a different way that's more meaningful and will provide support to many families in my school community so that they understand and appreciate the psychological sequela of the hurricane and figure out how I can help. So I would look in terms of what I could do maybe as a school psychologist to change priorities in my school so that it works better. All right, hope is really critical. Promote an optimistic outlook. Engage students in creating positive messages to share with families, friends, school, staff, all kinds of positive messages, put them all over there. And one of my colleagues, Patty Del Valle, which some people from Dade County may know, she used to ask people in the aftermath of Hurricane Andrew, she'd say, is it getting just a little teeny weeny bit better today than it was yesterday? And she'd say, I hope it's just getting just a little bit better. And so, and that really seemed to make a difference. Well, things aren't really much better today than they were yesterday, but yeah, a little bit, and that would create a positive mindset. Share stories of others who successfully overcome similar challenges. And that can be helpful. Find models of people that have done that. And help students create attainable goals and discuss ways they can overcome challenges to achieve their goals. So you can ask students, like, when did they have a problem and how did they master that problem? And that's an interesting conversation in regard to social emotional learning kinds of things. What did you do when you thought maybe you couldn't achieve your goals, but you were surprised and you found out that you could? Tell us a story about that. Let kids tell each other stories. That's really something very, very positive. I'll just put this on. I'm checking my time because I lost a little bit of time changing computers. Okay, but some of these kinds of things we've talked about, already. And children are very resilient. I found them to be, most resilient. And we talked about the 20-60-20 rule. And so it's maybe about 1/5 of the students that requires more intensive support. So these are the youngsters you're going to have to focus on, but I think everybody can use some support. And those are universal interventions that we can do. Some of the things we've already discussed. Okay. And make sure you have a lot of opportunities for children to share their concerns. If youngsters are just so overwhelmed or they don't want to hear about horrible stories from other people, then that really needs to be voluntary. So there's a lot of work, and I was trained by NOVA many years ago in terms of, crisis and group work. And a colleague of mine, Stephen Brockman, wrote our first big book on best practices in crisis prevention and intervention in the schools. He had a nice chapter in there about classroom crisis intervention activities. So you may wish to read that. It's an older book, but it's a really good chapter. Okay, so we've gone over some of these things already. So this is a little bit of a review. And here's some things that you can actually discuss. I find it's better not to ask students what they're feeling, but I find it's better to what reactions that they have. what went on in their lives? What was the event like? How did they experience it? Rather than ask them, about what did they feel? Mhm. Come up with the worst part, the best part, sometimes just getting it out and telling this story and telling this story and telling this story. What I find is really helpful is when the story becomes boring, then you're making progress. If they keep on retelling the story and it has less and less impact, and it's becoming, I've told the story time and time and time again, and it's not as impactful. That means the healing is going on. Does that make sense to people? Okay. So here are some kinds of things you can kind of look at. Oops. Okay. So here are some questions to even think about. And you as school psychologists can send home different worksheets to parents or send them out through email. And NASP has a lot of stuff. And I've written some things for NASP. I don't know if my stuff is still on there from years ago. But there's a lot of good suggestions that NASP has for parents. And then so here's some things I usually tell to parents. And Nella Costa, one of my students, and I wrote a nice chapter that's coming out in a book by Melissa Bray and Bruce Bracken and Leah Theodore. I think it's coming out this year in regard to supporting children in the aftermath of natural disasters. So some of this stuff, I got from this chapter, but here's a few different kinds of things and we have other things in our book chapter in regard to suggestions. And you can see here, okay, I got a 5-minute warning. Taking care of me is really important. Okay. And remember that crisis work can be rewarding and energizing, yet it's also very demanding, it's stressful, and it can be exhausting. Being in the moment when dealing with overwhelming grief and heartache presents emotional challenges. And therefore, self-care, I think, is vital. So here's a few lessons learned. I think in my book chapter, I have about 25 lessons learned, but it was a previous book chapter. But I'm just going to go through a few. When you don't know what to say, just listen, be present in the moment. A lot of questions kids are going to ask don't have answers. And that's okay. And kids are experts on their own feelings. So that's the most important thing to understand. You don't have to know exactly the right thing to say, just be there, be present. And I was reading a couple of books by Irvin Yalom, and that's one of the kinds of things that he also expresses. Very famous psychotherapist. Avoid saying, I know how you feel. You probably don't. Even if you had a similar experience. So just tell me, how you reacted, or tell me how you feel. And your experience will be different than any other child. Never lie to children. Don't give them fabricated kinds of information, and some people use some like religious analogies. I'm not really that keen on that, or blaming God or not blaming God or anything like that. Don't provide false assurances or make promises that you cannot keep. If you're going to make a promise, keep it. Otherwise, don't do it. There's no right way to respond to trauma. There's no right way to respond to grief. Respect and appreciate the way each student attempts to cope. learn about bereavement and grief. And so there's a lot of good textbooks on that. I wrote something in a previous book about how children grieve, and I'm writing something up for something called the Conversation that goes out to the AP, the Associated Press, that I'll probably have out in a month, that talks about helping children grieve. Understand that each individual will respond to the crisis event according to their own personal trauma histories, their sense of resilience, their sense of personal agency, and their own unique coping skills. And help create a sense of community to enable students to move forward. So look into yourself as a focus. What can I do to create a supportive, caring, and nurturing community in my school, both with my students in the school and with the teachers and staff? And focus on student strengths and find a way for each student to make a meaningful contribution. Whether it's big or small, it can be small, but what can you contribute? And I think when kids can make a little contribution, it's very emotionally helpful to them. Oops. All right, so I would like to thank Frank Zaneri, because Frank is a former student of mine and knows more about crisis intervention than I'll ever know. And we've responded to many, many crises together and led some crisis teams across the country. Special thanks to Mike, he was on here as well, because we worked in terms of delineating the 5 essential elements of crisis response. And I'd like to also thank all the people that I've worked with over the years, especially from Miami-Dade and Broward County, in terms of my students for helping me with this. And special thanks to Anela Costa for her collaboration on our upcoming book chapter called Supporting Students in Schools in the Aftermath of Natural Disasters. So, and so that's a quick shout out. And for further information, you can get in touch with me, and I'd be glad to respond and, to your questions. So I'm going to stop sharing.
And Phil, we did have a couple of really good questions come in. I don't know if you have a few minutes to entertain those.
Yes, I do.
Okay, excellent. So one of the questions that we got is, what is the approach or advice that you have in supporting our students with recognized special needs, particularly those with more maybe intensive needs with, responding to the storm?
Okay. Certainly, sometimes kids with intensive needs do have intensive support. So I would look in terms of, connecting with their support network and their special education teachers, et cetera, to do that. And then if it's really happening in the family, to reach out to the families and have conversations with the families. So I kind of almost like have a community psychology approach working in schools. And so if the kid is really having a problem, you don't have to have meetings just to do empty, staffings and stuff. So say, come on in, let's talk about it. Let's come up with some ideas. Let's see how we can be creative. Let's have a conversation. And now with Zoom technology, it's even easier to do that, especially with working parents, et cetera. So that's what I would say to that particular question.
And I know also that I've seen some adaptable resources for, events like these. So I'm happy to, I'll dig those up and see if I can send those to everybody with the link and the recording and the other links that I've shared in the chat. So another question that we got, Phil, and this is maybe a little bit of a tricky one, is given the current legislation, what guidance can you provide in terms of gaining parental support or parental consent to support students?
Parental support?
Parental consent. I'm guessing that this person was referring to House Bill 1557, which requires that parents are notified of any, screenings that we do. They're able to review them, and they give consent to any kind of mental health support services that we are engaging in.
Yeah, that you're right. That is certainly a tricky one because and you could look in terms of either passive or positive consent. And I guess you may have to consult with the legal team in regard to what is being done as it relates to, passive consent. And so say we're going to be having, discussions in regard to the crisis and it's part of the, what we do in schools to share information and provide support to children and just send that information out to the parents. And if you have any questions or concerns, just get in touch with me, your school counselor, your school psychologist, etc. And so that might be, the best way to go about it, especially since you're doing it with everybody. When you're doing it with select people, then you're going to require some consent.
Right.
And so if you're doing tier 2 interventions, I would try and get some consent as it relates to tier 2 interventions.
I think that's a great suggestion. And I will also check with our Department of Ed liaison for school psychology and see if she can just maybe give any kind of clarification. So I'll definitely be doing a follow-up for all of our attendees. You will receive the handouts, the recording, and I've got a bunch of links compiled for you, and I'll continue to gather some resources, and we'll be pushing those out through social media. We'll push those out through our fast flashes. If you don't receive those, I'll put my email in the chat and we can get you added to our communication list. Thank you all so much for joining us tonight. I know that some of you all have internet that's coming in and out, and it's a late evening, but we're just so grateful that you were able to join us, and we're just so grateful for everything you're doing to support students and families. And Dr. Lazarus, thank you so much for offering this. I'm gonna let Juliana, who's our CE coordinator, just hop on real quick to give any last minute kind of wrap up for folks who are needing CEs.
And I'd be glad to stay on for, respond to any questions after, this workshop is over. So I'll stay on for a little bit of time and respond to some individual, concerns or questions people may have. So I'll stay on for another half hour if people just need to talk and chat.
It was great. It was great. Thank you, Phil.
Yeah.
My pleasure. My pleasure.
Wait, I'm sorry. Can y'all hear me?
There we go.
Okay, I didn't realize I had my thing flipped up. So I did post a statement in the chat. Please give the CE committee 24 hours. We will verify everyone's time and send a link from Qualified. Click on that link and follow it to complete the survey. Once you complete the survey, you will be then given the opportunity to do your certificate of attendance. As you enter your name, if you have a license number through any of the Florida Department of Health boards that FAST is a provider for, please put your license number with that correct code in front of it. So if it's a PY or an SS or an SW, so that we can then enter that. So at the time your certificate of attendance is generated, screenshot it, download it. FAST does not maintain copies of those. If you need to, you can go back in and redo it and just re-enter your information in the link. And we will give you 1 week, and then we will pull those, and I will enter those into CE Broker. So because this is manual, thank you for your patience. It does take us a minute or a week, but within 24 hours, you will have your link to your certificate and the survey and your certificate of completion.
Thank you, Juliana.
Thank you so much.
I'm going to stop the recording here, but I see a lot of folks have stayed on. So Dr. Lazarus, please feel free to